I'm going to show you how to do a little bit of optimization. So I'm going to keep the stats up. Keep in mind, I mean, they're going to take this with a bit of a grain of salt. But anyways, the main thing we're looking at are the batches. Now this is a Cinti's dungeon demo scene, right? Beautiful little scene, horrendous to run, all right? It's not made for that at all. The intention was never for that anyways. But we want to make it so that it runs a lot smoother than how it is going to run. So I set up a little camera, and it's actually going to fly through this cave to the end. And just pay attention to these batches, right? The batches, the frames, the CPU main, the render thread. See how high they are. Now, of course, as the camera's getting closer to the end of the level, the batches are dropping off. That's because there's cone in front of the camera. There's not much. It's getting less and less and less. And of course, as the batches drop off, your frames improve greatly. So how do we do that? How can we make it run good all the time? So I'm going to use Mesh Combine. So after importing the project, you just get a prefab, and you just drag it into the scene. Okay. Now it can do numerous things. For me, the main way I use it is I create folders, and I like to create my own meshes, my combined meshes. It seems to make the most sense to me for a lot of that stuff. Now, keep in mind, any combined meshes aren't going to be moving, so you don't want to do it with things that can move, such as doors, or maybe you have objects like chairs and stuff like that. Don't combine those. There's other things to do with those. This is mainly, like the walls, the floor, and stuff like that. If they aren't going to move, they're going to be static objects. You can mark them as static, and that helps in some degree, but mesh combining, as you'll see very, very quickly here, is much better. I mean, even just looking at in the editor, right, we're at 17,000 frames or batches, and if I grab the crystal caves, and this is why I actually chose this demo scene, is Cinti's already has this kind of broken up. Now they're relatively big chunks. I would personally, if I was to do this, like these ones are good for size, like the cellar, the lab, the furnace, the barracks. Some of these I would probably cut into a couple, but whatever. You don't want to just do everything at once. You don't want, like, you can do that. It's a horrendous way. And one of the things is, for example, if this whole thing, if this entire level was one mesh, one giant mesh, and you had a light right over here shining on this small area, okay, and you were playing and you were over here facing this corner, Unity has to render the entire mesh. It can't render part of a mesh. It has to render the entire mesh, and then any part that has light, it has to kind of do all the calculations for light. So if you had a light way over here shining on this side, and this is one mesh, and you were over here, that light is drastically cutting your performance down. So it makes a lot more sense, especially if you have like frustrum culling and stuff like that involved to improve it even farther, that you would just break these into little areas, sections, so that you can stream them in and out. But with that said, we have our Mesh Combine studio here. So I took the crystal caves, this root object that's got all the prefabs underneath it, right? No doors or nothing like that, right? This is just the static objects. And if I want, I can mark it as static. I always uncheck that just to make sure I catch everything. And that's fine for the search conditions. This stuff I don't usually worry about too often. I'm going to take this and actually ram this up. It's a bigger area. I want to make sure I cover everything. I don't worry too much about a lot of these. If you have a higher poly model and the model is in the terrain, this remove tries below surface, it can be really cool. It doesn't work that great for lower poly stuff, but anyways, it's not what this is about. So I'm going to do a search, and it finds all the meshes, right? Draws the boxes, and I combine. Now, technically, we could just leave it like that, just walk away now, and it works. But we're going to take this a step farther, right? So the original batches of just this, as it says, is 432. We just cut it down to 14, right? We didn't remove any of the vertices and triangles, but we have a very large boost. But now this is where the magic comes in. I'm going to save combined. So let's go to our folder that we made, to this thing, and we'll call this one like the Crystal Caves. We go into here, we select that. Now it saves. Now it will break it up based on the number of vertices, because typically we don't go over, I think it's 65,000-ish for vertices, unless we bring in some special stuff. And it also breaks it up based on the material, right? But now that we've done that, this is what we're going to do. I'm going to hit delete combined. That's it. And I am going to take this Crystal Caves, and I'm going to deactivate it for now. And I'm going to create a new empty down here, and we're going to call this Crystal Caves. And I'm going to, actually I'm going to zero that, because if you look at this one, oh, I might have messed that up already. It's in a 0 position. I want this one to be in that same position, right? Oh, if it's not in 0, you can just copy its transform to this one. And then this one I'm going to create empties. And you can name these. I don't usually, I think it's because of sheer laziness, but we now have all these meshes. So if I start bringing stuff in, right, I drop it in. Okay, we're going to need some more empties, obviously. So I'm just going to duplicate a whole bunch of these. Bloop, 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 bloop. All right, and then usually what I do, so I don't get lost, is I click on one, I click on the next, I grab that mesh, stick it down, click on that mesh, grab the next, bring it down, and I just kind of, you drag each of these meshes, just one, you just need one of each, but you want each mesh in here, right? And the mesh is actually named after the material that it was using, which is going to come pretty important. All right, so we don't need these empty objects. So there we have the big pink thing. So now we can go over and we say, okay, dungeon material 1. Now we go over and we say, oh, there's the material. There you go. Now, these ones were all dungeon material 1 until that guy. But those ones all use the same material. This guy uses number 2. If you want, at this point in time, with the way these assets work, you can actually start swapping materials around and stuff too. I'm not going to worry about that. I'm just going to maintain the same. Dungeon material ice, which is in the miscellaneous. And snow, which is also in the miscellaneous. So now, if we look at it, it looks exactly the same. But it is quite drastic. And if we actually take these so we can do this. We can do a side-by-side comparison. Let's take the crystal caves. So here's the crystal caves, just the crystal caves and the lighting. And we have 2,800 batches, right? So our combined version of this is 146 batches. That's a lot better, right? So now I can say, okay, well, let's make a prefab of that. Drag it in there, now we have a prefab. So now we have that. So I think what I'll do is I'll pause the video, and I'm gonna do that exact same thing, but with all of those. Right? I'll do the exact same procedure as I did with the crystal caves, but we'll combine them, and then I'll do well, I'll unpause it. You guys won't see that because it'll be paused, and then we'll do the fly through, and we'll look at the comparison in the stats. Okay, so there we go. I made folders and have combined them all using that exact same method. Some are bigger than others, and some are smaller. Then I prefabbed them all. So I got all the originals here, but they're deactivated. I didn't do the fog planes, so that's more of a particle effect almost. The mesh combined, now that I'm done with it, I'm going to delete it. We don't need it. We have just, and it looks exactly the same. Everything's in the same position. Nothing has changed. Right. It is exactly how they had it. Only you'll see a drastic difference here, right? Like if we deactivate the combined ones and reactivate those ones, right? We have you know, almost 17,000 batches, and that's rough. Oh, I'm missing something, or something's above where it's supposed to be, like this little room right here. I never zeroed it. There we go. Okay, now everything's in the normal position. Right? But yeah, so there, and it's you'll often find your triangles will go up a little bit, but your performance is drastically increased. And that's due to Unity's built-in kind of culling system and stuff like that, where, I mean, if your camera was sitting here, it doesn't render or care about anything behind it that it can't see. That's kind of built into Unity. If they're combined meshes, though, if we can see a part of it, then the whole combined mesh has to be rendered, which is why your polys typically go up a little bit. But your batches drop off way down, your performance goes way up. So now beyond that, I mean, we could add some occlusion culling, and it would improve it a fair bit more. But let's not right now, and let's hit play. Let's see what happens now that our batches are low. As you see, like, the frames they were at 37ish before. This was, they're over 30, this was over 20, right? Our batches are way down, frames are way up, processing is way better. It is drastically improved. Right? Well, we have some lighting stuff happening there. And that's just one of those things that we can fit, we can adjust. There's a few other things if you want real quick, like cascade shadows. If it's high quality models you're dealing with realistic, you're going to want your cascades, because things will look better. If you're dealing with low poly, notice how we're at 600 batches. If I go to no cascades, it should drop down a little bit. I must not have. The other thing we could do is go to our materials and we highlight them, and this is usually turned off by default. And if you want the batches, and this will help whether you combine or not combine. It's not drastic for a help, but by turning that on, we should see those batches actually come down a little more. Let's take this up. I think that's the number I'm looking at. Whoa, let's not go crazy. No, you know what? Let's go crazy. Screw it. One of the other things is I didn't even check with the camera. It's on graphical. What are we on? The other thing is, and it always runs, to me, I always go, like, just default, I stick it to deferred. Running path forward. And deferred to me is just so much better. Like look at the batches have gone up because I cranked on all the lighting there. But you see how we're at 1,700 batches, and deferred we're 400. Deferred lighting, or the deferred rendering path is awesome. I always run that. There, now we have 500 batches, 700, 400 frames. So you take a bit of a grain of salt, but the milliseconds on the processing is super low, right? You have tons of room to add wicked character controllers and complex AI and stuff. Yeah, see all the lighting there is better now. I fixed up with that increase of pixel light count. But there you have it. Improving performance dramatically. Like with the light cranked up and the deferred and the GPU instancing on. With the original, this is where we're at right now. It isn't that bad with the other things also kicked on. It's not as good. So with the deferred stuff, the GPU instancing helped a lot, but still not quite as good, not nearly as good as the combined. But said don't combine doors and stuff like that. Just your static things, and try to do smaller things like rooms, right? And then really from there, once you get that done, right? If you go over and create new occlusion areas, it's way excessively large for what we have. But whatever. Not all that concerned about it right now. We should probably make sure we're actually mark those static. Not that they need to be static, but they need to be putting the occluder and occludee static. But just marking them static is just an easier, faster way of doing that. And if you haven't seen occlusion culling, I don't know how well it'll work. Like it looks like right looks messed up, right? Like, oh my God, where'd my map go? But that's part of what occlusion culling does, right? Like if I take that camera, it's culling out what we can't see, right? And that's another big help in performance, right? So we have, and which is also why it's important to keep those meshes, the rooms and the combining smaller, so that you can add in things like the occlusion culling, and it's a lot more effective. Right? Yeah, you can't tell the occlusion culling is on, right? But it is. Right? Like if I pause it, you see like in here, like you can't see it because you see everything. Like if I click on the occlusion, this is what's actually being processed. Right? So let's turn off my animator, or else it's not going to let me turn the camera. Let's go back to the occlusion. Right, so we can see it. See how that's working. And I just used the basic occlusion setup. I didn't go hard on it or anything. So I'm just playing with it. It's not a occlusion culling tutorial. It's more or less a mesh combine, but the occlusion culling is kind of part of it. Because if you really want performance, you're going to want to be doing everything you can. So there you have it. Increase your performance with a few steps.